Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I've got two compact PCs that I'm going to be comparing. I've got a Dell Optiplex 7010 USFF with a Core i7-3770S and a Lenovo ThinkCentre M700 Tiny with an Intel Core i5-6500T. I want to know how they compare against each other in terms of both performance and upgradability, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Let's start with some of the physical features of these two computers, specifically I/O, upgradability, and expandability. Firstly, looking at the Lenovo, on the front it's got two USB 3 ports, one of which is a charging port, and it's also got separate headphone and microphone jacks. We've also, of course, got the power button. And flipping around to the back, we can see that Lenovo made what I think to be a pretty good use of the small area they had for rear I/O. A power port, 3 display ports, one of which is modular and can be switched out for a VGA if wanted, gigabit Ethernet, 4 USB 3 ports, as well as a Wi-Fi antenna connection point and a headphone jack, leads to this system having a pretty versatile selection of I/O. Comparing the I/O on the Lenovo to the I/O on the Dell certainly starts to show that the Dell is a third generation system. The Dell has separate microphone and headphone jacks on its back, a VGA port, 2 display ports, serial, 2 USB 3 and 2 USB 2 ports, as well as gigabit Ethernet. The big difference between the Dell and the Lenovo back here is that the Dell has an internal power supply. This internal power supply is a much higher wattage than the power brick that the Lenovo comes with, but I actually think that this makes little to no difference in which system is better for a reason that I'll explain more in a moment. Though, if you can't afford to have another power brick for cable management reasons, then the Dell might be more compelling. I'd also like to quickly add, replacement adapters for the Lenovo and replacement internal power supplies for the Dell are about the same price on eBay, so replacement costs shouldn't be too much a concern. Moving to the front of the Dell, in terms of I/O, it's identical to the Lenovo with its 2 USB 3 ports and separate headphone and microphone jacks. Though there is one major difference here, and that is the slim DVD drive slot. My specific 7010 USFF is missing the DVD drive that one could put here, but if having a DVD drive is important, the 7010 wins there because you don't have to deal with an external USB thing. Next, let's talk about expandability / upgradability, ease of disassembly, repair, whatever you want to call it. Basically, just the hardware, because this is computer hardware tips and tutorials after all. To get into the Lenovo, there's a singular screw on the back that you can undo to release the top panel, which slides forward and then comes off. This gives you access to the internals of the machine and is really nice and easy to do. Inside this computer, we can see immediately that there is a 2.5-inch SATA drive slot, which I have populated with an SSD containing the system image I use personally on this computer. Removing the SATA drive is as easy as undoing this single thumb screw, unplugging one of the Wi-Fi antenna wires because one of the antennas is mounted to the drive tray, and then sliding it away from the motherboard mounted SATA connector. This is also a good point to add a little side note that the Lenovo has Wi-Fi while the Dell does not. The drive itself is mounted to this caddy with these little rubber grommets that just slide into place to hold the drive. Underneath this SATA drive and its caddy, we're greeted with 2 SODIMM slots that can hold DDR4 SODIMM modules. I currently have a bit of a hodgepodge of the only 2 spare DDR4 SODIMM modules that I have on hand here right now, those being an 8GB and 4GB module. Because I don't have a 16GB kit for either of these systems, and the next highest amount I can configure them both with is 8GB, I'll be pulling my 4GB stick out. This will run this system at single channel, while the 7010 does run at dual channel, but it's the best I can do for these tests. Just behind the SODIMM slots, there's another slot that makes the system even more feature-packed, an M.2 2280 slot. Having an M.2 slot available is an awesome feature because this means that the Lenovo is built to be capable of having 2 drives in it. However, there is a catch with this port. It's SATA only. That's definitely a bummer, especially considering that 6th generation Intel CPUs can do NVMe drives. I have a system with a 6500 non-T that's using an NVMe drive, and I'd assume that the 6500T is capable of the same thing, though I wasn't easily able to find a definitive answer online. Still, nice to be able to have 2 drives, but a shame that this system doesn't support NVMe ones. The last thing I'm going to do is pull off the CPU cooler, both to give a fresh application of thermal paste for ultimate fairness in the thermal tests, as well as to show you another cool aspect of this computer. Even though it's such a small form factor, the CPU is socketed. So, in theory, if you have one of these systems with something like an i3-6100T, you could upgrade it without replacing the motherboard. Whether or not these systems support 7th generation T-series CPUs is something I'm unsure of, but if that's possible, that makes the socketed CPU even cooler. Before I move on to the Dell, here's a quick fun fact about this Lenovo mini-PC. I was playing with a new macro lens on this computer a while before starting this channel and got some pretty cool shots of it. When I first started this channel, those shots ended up becoming my channel's artwork, and you can see this exact mini-PC in my channel banner and profile picture. Now onto the Dell. To get into the Dell, there's a single captive thumb screw on the back that releases the side panel, which is a pretty cool little touch compared to the regular screw Lenovo used. Once inside the Dell, the front panel can be unclipped and the drive carrying assembly can be removed. Getting the cables unplugged from this assembly while removing and installing it can be a challenge, but it's overall not the worst it could be. The Dell has a spot for a single 2.5-inch SATA drive, and of course that slot for the DVD drive. Immediately, the Dell is lacking one thing that the Lenovo does have, the M.2 slot. Though the Lenovo's M.2 was sadly SATA only, the Dell doesn't have one at all. In fact, the only expansion slot in the Dell is a mini-PCI slot that a Wi-Fi card or something could be put into. Another big difference between the Dell and the Lenovo is that the Dell has the room for 2 full-size DIMM slots. These slots can take DDR3 modules, though sadly there are only 2 slots here. I've populated them with 2 4GB DDR3 1600 MHz modules for these tests. Additionally, under the CPU cooler, which is much larger than the one in the Lenovo, there's a socketed CPU. This is much less impressive considering how much larger this Dell is than the Lenovo, but it's still a nice to have. Remember how I said that the power supply in the Dell is a lot bigger than the one that the Lenovo uses, but that doesn't matter too much? Well, the Dell has a 200-watt power supply, and the Lenovo has a 65-watt power supply. The Dell's larger power budget would make it a really awesome computer if there were any PCIe slots, which there aren't. It's a tightly packed system, so the lack of PCIe isn't egregious or anything, but it is just a little disappointing considering how this power supply could probably take a 75-watt card, with the power-limited 3770S not eating too much of the power budget. Also, as a little note for anyone who might be considering using a SATA power splitter and shoving another SATA drive into this Dell in some empty space, this motherboard only has 2 SATA ports, so you'll need to sacrifice the DVD drive if that's something you're thinking about doing. After imaging the 7010 with Windows, which I'm using because Windows is the most popular OS, and therefore Windows performance is the performance that the majority of people care about. If you are someone who knows Linux and wants to use these systems, Linux would be a good idea for you. But anyway, now that we're imaged with Windows 10 Pro, updated and slightly debloated, I was able to get started with my first benchmark. Before that though, I should mention that both of these systems were tested with fresh installs on a 256GB Silicon Power A55 SATA SSD. In the multi-core test in Cinebench R23, the system scored a 3393 with the CPU sitting around 88 degrees Celsius while drawing approximately 45 watts of power. Then, in single core, the system scored a 772. I won't spoil anything, but in comparison to the Lenovo, these numbers are pretty interesting. Let's get into some real-world tests. I only have a few here because both of these systems are absolutely fine in web browsing and YouTube streaming, and so I was just left with some audio and video editing, as well as a few CAD tests. Starting out with the easiest of the 4 that I have, Audacity. For those who don't know, Audacity is a free audio recording and editing software that is relatively capable. Audacity is a very light software, and so I'm only going to spend a couple of seconds here because, unsurprisingly, the system handled some basic audio editing tasks like applying compression and EQ to a bunch of clips at a time perfectly fine. Hopping now into a 3D CAD software, which I think might struggle with the integrated Intel HD 4000 graphics, which wouldn't let me update their driver for some reason. Though Windows did pull one, it was just a couple years old. In any case, Autodesk Fusion is a software that I'll be testing out here, and while just making a random thing, the system was usable. So it can do 3D CAD in Fusion if you need it to, but I will say that it wasn't the nicest experience because it was not very responsive. It felt like I was doing CAD on a remote desktop that was being accessed by another remote desktop that I was then remoted into. In other words, sluggish and spongy. For reference, this is how snappy a more powerful computer is in Fusion, though this is not a fair comparison in terms of price. But in the end, I was able to design something, and so it did work. Though unpleasurable for someone who's spoiled with snappy high-end computers, the system is capable of 3D modeling, and it's important to remember that if something's all you have, then it's the best you have, and if you want to do CAD work on an older computer, don't let it stop you if it's capable of running the software. Branching off ever so slightly from Fusion, let's test out Cura to make sure that the system isn't horribly slow at slicing a model. With a relatively complex model that I found on Thingiverse, link in the description, I gave it a slice with some reasonable settings for this kind of a print. And yeah, it took a while to slice at 1 minute 30 seconds, but it was overall okay. So for more complex models than Cura with this Dell system, just hit slice, grab a slice of toast or something, come back, and it shouldn't be too much of an issue. though this model is arguably unusually complex, so how about some simpler models that I usually deal with? Here are some of the models that go with my custom LED lighting system, and with the same settings, they took about 15 seconds to slice, which is absolutely fine. In the end, in 3D CAD, the computer can do it. It's not the best experience, but if you want to do some CAD, this thing is absolutely able to get you there, it just might take a tiny bit longer. So, with the audio and 3D CAD tests out of the way, only one remains: video editing in DaVinci Resolve. I was ready to do some decent testing here, and I'm sure some of you are looking forward to this test, but sadly there was a massive issue. DaVinci Resolve will not start with HD 4000 graphics. Intel's HD 4000 is no longer supported by DaVinci, and that usually wouldn't be the biggest issue of all time if you were able to put a dedicated GPU into the computer. But, as mentioned before, there are not any PCIe slots that one can use to install a GPU, so this computer completely fails my video editing test in DaVinci Resolve. It's probable that another editor might start up and run on this system, but it's equally probable that it's going to be a pretty horrible experience within those editors due to the lacking iGPU that this CPU has. I was hoping to see this computer be a decent little 1080p editing PC with its 4 cores and 8 threads, but not today. So with that, it's time to move over to the Lenovo and do these same tests again with a fresh install of Windows 10 on the same SSD that I used in the 7010. It was while switching these drives over that I had a thought that some of you might care about. If you're looking at using one of these systems in a way where you'll be switching out the SATA drive in it often, the Dell is really not a good choice for this. The drive mounting system, assuming you're mounting the drive and not just throwing it in, is quite finicky and inefficient when changing drives. The Lenovo's isn't absurdly better on its own, but if you get multiple sets of the mounting grommets and put them on all of your drives, the Lenovo's SATA drive becomes a very easy thing to quickly switch out if that's something that you might see yourself doing. In any case, I've now got the Lenovo set up for these tests, so let's start it off with Cinebench R23 and the CPU power as well as thermals. In the multi-core test in Cinebench R23, the Lenovo M700 Tiny with its Core i5-6500T scored a 2305 while running at about 72 degrees Celsius and drawing about 24 watts. In single core, it performed nearly identical to the 3770S with a score of 774 as compared to the 3770's 772. The difference in the multi-core test of approximately 32% is likely due to the fact that the 6500T has only 4 cores and 4 threads as compared to the 4 cores 8 threads in the i7. Though the 6500T performed far worse in the multi-core test, with no advantage in the single core test either, the one thing that it did have over the 3770S in raw CPU compute is its power draw. The 3770S drew about 45 watts on the CPU package when running the multi-core test, and the 6500T only drew about 24. That's almost half of what the 3770S did, and a little bit more than half the performance of the 3770S. With that interesting bit of Cinebench data, let's put this system through its paces in Audacity. Once more, I have next to nothing to say here, other than that this system did absolutely fine in Audacity. It actually appeared to perform about the same as the 3770S did when applying effects to several clips of audio at once, likely because Audacity doesn't use tons of cores and the single core performance of these computers is identical. Now it's time for both of the CAD softwares, Fusion and Cura. The Lenovo with its 6500T and HD 530 graphics had the same issue in Fusion that the Dell did, but maybe to a bit of a lesser extent. Modeling on this system was still more than doable, and so if this is your option, it should work just fine for you. In the end, it was really about the same outcome as the 3770S exhibited, but maybe ever so slightly better. In Cura, there was a very noticeable difference in the slice times with the Lenovo, and not in the Lenovo's favor. The complex model took about 2 minutes 15 seconds on the Lenovo, whereas it took about 1 minute 30 seconds on the Dell. The simpler model was identical in performance on both the Dell and the Lenovo though, taking 15 seconds to slice on both systems. Overall, in CAD, the Lenovo does alright. It's slightly more responsive in Fusion, likely due to the newer iGPU, though it falls behind in a more CPU-intensive workload like Cura because of the missing hyperthreading on its chip. Finally, it's time to end these tests on DaVinci Resolve. And would you look at that, the Lenovo's already in the lead because DaVinci has actually opened on it unlike on the Dell. But even though DaVinci opened and got a project started relatively quickly, does not mean that editing on the timeline is going to be very nice. I went ahead and started out trying to edit something that was, in full honesty, way too harsh. I have a few of the clips from one of my previous videos, and these clips are in 4K at 30 FPS encoded with H.264. This is not easy footage to deal with, and even my editing workstation has some moments with it. Though on my main editing system, I do have the timeline resolution set to 4K, and this time I made the conscious decision to set the timeline resolution to 1080p. The system was unable to play the footage back in real time, at least without any optimized media or proxies. So if your goal is to edit your higher end footage on one of these systems without proxy media or optimized media, you should probably change your goal. I next had the system go ahead and generate optimized media for this clip to see if that would help make it more workable on the timeline, and that's when I discovered how painfully slow this system was at generating the optimized media for one of the clips that I brought in. It took about 13 minutes to create this clip's optimized media. Even though the optimized media made the clip more than workable on the timeline, as you can see here, it took a very long time to generate, and if you have several clips that you want this media for, the system will take hours to even get the clips to a point where you can start editing them. Not to mention the ludicrous size of optimized media in DaVinci Resolve. It will happily turn 10 gigs of footage into 200 plus gigabytes of optimized media, so if you plan to do that, you better have the storage. Even though the system had been struggling up until this point, and this footage wasn't fair to it, I decided to give a quick tracking blur a shot on this clip that's been turned into optimized media. Tracking the blur took a while to process, and after applying the blur effect and seeing how responsive the clip still was on the timeline, I noticed that this blur effect tanked the smoothness that optimized media got us. The clip plays pretty stuttery now, and overall is not a great experience. Now, I've mentioned that this isn't a very fair test to the system because this isn't easy footage to work with. I've dedicated a full overclocked 12900K and ARC A750 to handling these files, and they don't hesitate to use all of that hardware. So I quickly filmed some random shots of the computer and keyboard that I had set up on my iPhone in 1080p at 30 FPS. With these much lighter clips in a new project, once more with a 1080p timeline, the system was handling a lot better. It's still a little rough at some points, but even with a tracking blur, the footage was mostly able to play smoothly. Though 2 video clips at the same time was not having it. I don't know what DaVinci is on about when it claims a solid 30 FPS, but you can see that it is very much not playing smoothly. The last comment I have is that render times might be a little bit tough with a system like this. I had approximately 45 seconds of video on the timeline, and the export took 1:40 seconds. So a little over 2 seconds of render time per second of footage on the timeline in this case. It's not too bad. I'm obviously spoiled with my A750 and its 5 minutes of timeline video and 1 minute of export time, but this little system really didn't do bad. It could get annoying when working on much larger projects, but for smaller, lower-end video editing projects, a system like this will be able to do the job. Overall, both of these systems show that they're still capable machines as long as you aren't doing very heavy tasks. If you're looking to use one of these as a CAD machine, either one will be able to do it, though if possible, getting something that would support a dedicated graphics card will be massively beneficial for that kind of workload. For basic web browsing and office workloads, either system is great, so the I/O and expansion and feature sets are really the things that should be the deciding factors. Lastly, if you want to do some simple video editing with low bitrate, 1080p 30 FPS footage, the Lenovo is the choice. The iGPU in the Lenovo is not the greatest by any stretch of the imagination, however, it smashes the one in the Dell, especially when considering that the Dell couldn't even launch DaVinci Resolve due to its unsupported GPU. In any case, that's all that I have for this video. Hopefully you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.